Throughout the 1920s, the city of Cleveland, Ohio boomed. The city's economy was largely dominated by the manufacture of steel, iron, cars and their respective replacement parts, chemicals and textiles, and employment was relatively high. As the sixth largest city in the entire US, it was a city on the up. Two entrepreneurs, brothers with a focus on real estate, Oris Paxton and Mantis James Van Sweringen, took note of this potential of Cleveland to house an emerging sizable middle class, and they wasted no time in building a suburban dream. They planned and oversaw construction of homes and parks around new, modern, private and public schools, complete with tree-lined streets. Noting that a key part of a successful suburb was its transport links to central Cleveland, they purchased the Nickel Plate Railroad and built up a public transportation network to cater for both the workforce and commercial aspirations of Clevelanders, culminating in the construction of the Cleveland Union Terminal in Public Square in the heart of the downtown area. It was a grand building with extravagant ceilings and Art Deco finishings. Terminal Tower, a large skyscraper standing at 235 metres, was the second largest building in the world when construction was completed in 1930. At a cost of $179 million, it was a serious monument to the industrial boom, and as both commercial centre and transport hub, it heralded a sign of great things to come for the future of Cleveland. This opulence, however, was not felt by all residents. Despite this prosperous facade, a gradual decline of quality of life and employment had slowly started creeping up unawares since 1927, and by October of 1929, the Great Depression had officially struck nationwide, turning this gradual slide into a severe downward spiral throughout both Cleveland and the country. One obvious reflection of this decline could be seen in the work undertaken by the Associated Charities, a community-driven and funded group in Cleveland who were helping those in need with financial assistance. In 1929, Associated Charities had 712 families officially on their books. By 1932, this number had increased to 26,000. Despite work initiatives offering low-paid menial labour for up to 3 days per week, a 1931 census found that almost 50% of the Cleveland population were unemployed or working low-paid, low-hour jobs, unable to support their families. Although many of the hardest hit were already struggling immigrant and African American communities who, following the crash of industry, now suffered from up to 90% unemployment rates, the middle class that just a handful of years prior were looking forward to a bright future now found themselves being hit just as hard. Their children were being taught by unpaid teachers and at times being sent home for not having shoes. Entire families were being fed for up to 2 weeks on one day's pay from the working initiatives of $4.50, and what started as small soup kitchens in 1927 had evolved into an industrial affair, with food and clothing now being distributed by local charities as an accepted norm. In 1933, the Cuyahoga County Relief Administration was set up, enveloping the Associated Charities, and with it, they took on board the 33,000 families it was officially propping up. By 1935, this number had more than doubled to 76,000. In 1931, there were 9,300 evictions citywide, a number that too had doubled since 1930, and by 1934 it rose to 13,000. Times were indeed tough and civil unrest was high. Workers' strikes and protests were a common occurrence, and they were not always peaceful. As for the Van Sweringens, their dream lay in tatters. Several of their railroads had fallen to bankruptcy, and they had defaulted on a $48 million loan from JP Morgan. With little to show financially from their promising earlier years, both men died within 2 years of each other. At the time of their deaths in 34 and 36, their net worth had fallen from $3 billion to just $3,000. With poverty and homelessness at such a high, shantytowns had risen up. Known as Hoovervilles, a name they took from Herbert Hoover, the president in office at the time, these were ramshackle enclaves of scavenged wood and steel, closely packed and full of a population driven by financial desperation. Two of the largest Hoovervilles in Cleveland were known as Kingsbury Run and Whiskey Island. They were a harsh representation of an economic situation that gripped the US population and squeezed tighter as each month passed. Kingsbury Run was a dark and dangerous place, populated by the poor, homeless, dispossessed and those hit hardest by the Great Depression. It was a refuse-filled area of land on the eastern side of Cleveland, nestled on the banks of the Cuyahoga River. In reality, it was little more than a dumping ground for the city's waste, but it had land enough, and so the population grew. In the west was an area known as the Roaring Third, a den of illegality, home to many of the city's bars, brothels and gambling houses. It offered both a refuge for some and a problem for the authorities. It's safe to say that the times were hard and financial instability was cutting deep into the population of Cleveland, as it was around the whole of the US. In this atmosphere of severe poverty, decaying refuse, civil unrest and desperation, there was another, more violent nightmare coming over the horizon. It was within Kingsbury Run that a man who became known as the Mad Butcher was preparing to throw down his violent and bloody stool. On September the 5th, 1934, 34-year-old Frank Lagasse was searching by the banks of Lake Erie for driftwood. He noticed something bobbing in the water. On closer inspection, Lagasse realised he had discovered something very grim indeed. What he originally thought to be a tree trunk turned out to be the headless, limbless lower half of the torso of a woman, her legs removed from the knees. Cuyahoga County Coroner A.J. Pierce noted in reports that her body had been treated or preserved with some kind of oil that had given the skin a leathery appearance. With so little of the woman's body found, however, it was impossible to both identify her or to give a confident cause of death, the only notable detail about the victim being that she was in her 30s. Her body was estimated as being in the water for up to 3 or 4 months, though with the preservative treatment this was difficult for the police to nail down with any certainty. This unnamed woman was never identified, nor was the remainder of her corpse ever found. She became known as the Lady of the Lake, and 2 years later, Victim Zero. For now, however, she was simply the victim of a gruesome murder that left no leads to follow. For the next year, her remains faded into an obscure memory, the perpetrator long forgotten. Things were far from quiet in the streets of Kingsbury Run, but at least no more pieces of bodies were found. That was until just over 1 year later, on the 23rd of September 1935. 2 young boys, James Wagner and Peter Pastora, were playing catch atop an embankment known as Jackass Hill in southern Kingsbury Run. One made an overthrow and the ball careered down the slope. The boys chased it down the hill, stopping at the bottom to root round in the bushes where they had last seen it as it bounced and disappeared from view. Rather than a ball, however, what they found was so traumatic that the first boy to discover the body leapt backwards and dragged the second over to the scene, speechless. In the bushes lay the decapitated body of a man, naked except from his socks. After the police arrived, they began the search to find the victim's head, and instead found a second body around 30 feet away, once again decapitated. The police continued to search and found both heads partially buried, the first around 20 feet away from his body and the second around 75 feet away. They also found a metal bucket that contained a torch and an oily substance that had mixed with traces of blood left on the rim. Once again, the coroner Pierce was given the duty of determining cause of death, and his findings were macabre in the least. Aside from the initial obvious decapitation of both bodies, Pierce found that the first body had rope burns around his wrist, and that the second had hardened skin that had become discoloured. Upon closer examination, they found his body hair had been burnt away, and thus concluded that appearances, together with certain findings to indicate that this body after death was saturated with oil and fire applied. This burning, however, was only sufficient to scorch, hence the peculiar condition of the skin. He also found that both men had had their penises removed. The first was a white male, 5'11" and weighing 150 pounds, in his 20s with blue-grey eyes and brown hair. He was presumed to have been dead for 2 to 3 days. The second was a white male, 40 to 45 years old, 5'6", 165 pounds, with dark brown hair. He had been lying in the bushes a while longer, with initial estimates placing his death 7 to 10 days prior, though this was later revised to 3 to 4 weeks. In both cases, cause of death was attributed to death by decapitation, hemorrhage and shock. This meant that the victims had been alive when they were decapitated. Despite what would have been massive blood loss, there was no blood found at the scene aside from the small amount found on the metal bucket. Both bodies appeared to have been drained and then cleaned before being cast into the bushes. This time, the police did manage to identify one of the bodies from his fingerprints. The first man found was positively identified as Edward Andrassy, the 28-year-old son of Hungarian immigrants. His father and brother were called into the morgue and they gave a positive ID on Edward, who they had last seen 4 days earlier in perfect health. Edward Andrassy had led a somewhat colourful life and was known to frequently hang around the bars of the Roaring Third. Rumours flew around that Edward was bisexual and his sister was aware that he had had run-ins with mobsters in the past. Police called him a snotty punk, and his own father commented that he had hung around people of questionable character. The police therefore found themselves dealing with a victim who could, in all likelihood, have been killed by any one of a large number of people, leaving many leads which of course were entirely fruitless. The second body was proving to be quite the opposite of Andrassy. It was never identified and simply chalked up as Victim 1. Despite some of the obvious similarities, the police were yet to tie the two murders to the earlier discovery of the Lady of the Lake. Though they had linked Andrassy and Victim 1, deciding that they probably knew one another and were killed by the same person. The dust eventually settled and investigations ceased after they had effectively led the police nowhere. Of far more interest in the press than a couple of murders was the interesting new addition to the Cleveland police ranks, when the by now infamous Eliot Ness was called in by the new mayor of Cleveland, Harold Burton, to clean up crime and corruption in the city. Eliot Ness rode into Cleveland fresh on the coattails of his successes fighting crime lord Al Capone, now equally infamous for his activities as co-founder of the Chicago Outfit, an Italian-American organised crime organisation who rose to power during the period of Prohibition. Ness made quick time in Cleveland, cleaning up the police force of corruption, attacking the gambling dens and initiating new programs and concepts in the police force, ensuring the police were clearly represented on the streets by introducing marked police cars and revamping police academy training to better equip new police with the realities of working on the force. As Ness made headlines in the local press almost daily, the people of Cleveland may have been forgiven in thinking that their streets were on the way to becoming safer. That, however, was soon to change. In the early hours of Sunday, January the 26th, 1936, people in Kingsbury Run lay in their beds trying to sleep. This was made difficult for some as the barks of a dog punctured the cold winter night. Later that morning, local butcher and owner of the White Front Meat Market, Charles Page, was startled by a woman insisting that she had found a basket of what she believed to be hams was lying outside the Hart Manufacturing Building on East 21st Place. The woman had alerted Charles Page, concerned that his butcher shop might have been robbed, and so he accompanied her back to the basket. As it turned out, the items were not quite hams. Rather, the first item Page removed from the basket was an arm wrapped in newspaper. The police were called immediately, and Lieutenant Harvey Weitzel, Lieutenant David Cowles, Sergeant Hogan, and Detectives Shibley and Waxman promptly arrived on the scene and discovered several pieces of a human body wrapped tightly in the basket, and nearby several more pieces were stuffed into 2 burlap sacks. Over the next 10 days, the search turned up around half of an entire human female body, most of which had been left in a nearby vacant lot on Orange Avenue, along with a set of white cotton underwear wrapped in newspapers. The barking dog turned out to belong to James Marco, who provided the police with the time of the dog's apparent distress at around 2:30 a.m. This at least gave the detectives a window of time for which to investigate further. Outside of this clue, however, Little information was forthcoming until the body was identified via her fingerprints as local woman Florence Polly. Florence was known locally as Flo, was 42 years old and worked as a barmaid, waitress, and had previously been arrested on several occasions for working as a prostitute. Her ex-husband gave a statement to police telling them of how they had married for 6 years. However, Flo's drinking problem had caused rifts in the relationship that were eventually too great for the couple to overcome. She split with her husband after 6 years of marriage, intending to straighten herself out. However, she wound up instead existing on the fringes of society, living hand to mouth, with much of her money being sucked up by her ongoing and ceaseless problem with drink that had led her to violent outbursts. She had had several relationships since her split, many of them winding up abusive. On February the 7th, the remainder of Flo's body parts were found, minus the head, scattered across a fence behind a vacant house. Along with these parts was the upper half of her torso, from which Coroner Pierce was able to confirm that Flo had died, once again, from decapitation. The police traced forensic evidence left on the scene, but it all led nowhere, and Flo's friends were equally unhelpful in uncovering any new evidence. Once again, the dust settled on the murder, but once again, the quiet period would not last. Despite all the problems facing Cleveland throughout the 30s, it was a city that just about clung onto its successful facade. The recently completed construction works and tree-lined suburbs belied the reality. However, the shantytowns and slums were more than a clear reminder to any who ventured just a few blocks from this commercial front. In June of 1936, the Republican National Convention rolled into town, bringing with it a host of delegates who would of course not taken the sights on the banks of the filthy Cuyahoga River, flowing just behind the shimmering urban developments they were instead presented with. At 8:30 a.m. on the morning of Friday, June the 5th, just 3 days before the start of the convention, 2 young boys aged 11 and 13 were skipping out on school to go fishing. As they approached the East 55th Bridge, they spotted something in the bush and prodded it with their fishing poles. Wrapped in a pair of their trousers, to their surprise, was the head of a man. Shocked and traumatized by the sight, the boys ran home, where they hid until one of the boys' mothers returned home from work, eventually allowing them to alleviate themselves of the grim discovery. At first they were too terrified to cooperate with the police, refusing to lead the police back to the site, but after some convincing, they took the police to recover the head and begin the search for the remainder of the man's body. The next day, the body was found in what appeared to be a direct affront to the police. It had been dumped in some bushes directly in front of the Nickel Plate Police Department. The victim was 20 to 25 years old, thought to have been murdered 2 days before its discovery, and had been drained of blood and cleaned. The cause of death was determined by Pierce once again as decapitation. The coroner also discovered that the man had 6 tattoos: a cupid on an anchor, the names Helen and Paul with a dove, a butterfly, the top hat wearing cane carrying cartoon figure known as Jiggs, an arrow through a heart, and the initials WCG. Photographs of the tattoos were circulated around tattoo parlours throughout the country, fingerprints were taken, and a plaster cast of the man's head was even taken and displayed at the Great Lakes Expo in an effort to garner information of his identity. No further information was forthcoming, however, and he was never identified. The body of the man was confusing for the detectives. The coroner's report stated that he was well nourished, clean-shaven, and dressed in clean, relatively new clothing. This description did not match with the poor and destitute victims that they had previously seen. This made it all the easier for police to deny what the press would not, that these murders were very likely to have all been connected. The next day, the Cleveland Press ran the headline, "Hunt for Fiend in 4 Decapitations," to an article that read, "Somewhere in the countless byways of the crowded southeast side, detectives believe today is the grisly workshop of a human butcher who in the last 10 months has carved up and decapitated 4 persons. Is there somewhere in the county a madman whose strange god is the guillotine, or has some fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher? Does he imagine himself a legal executioner of the French Revolution, or a religious zealot saving the human race with an axe? The period of time the bodies were uncovered may have been a fudge on the part of the press, but both they and the police knew this was a story that had legs, and thus the narrative of the Mad Butcher was thrust upon the public. Eliot Ness met with Sergeant James Hogan and head of the crime lab David Cowles to discuss the investigation of the murders. Hogan did not agree with the press and believed them to be unconnected due to their not sharing any common links in terms of motive. Jealousy, sexual deviation, revenge, none seemed to make much sense. Both Ness and Cowles, however, did agree with the press, and they believed them to be connected. Ness promised Hogan more support and manpower, instructing Cowles to put his department at Hogan's disposal. Hogan would have welcomed this greatly, as it would not be long before the Mad Butcher was to raise his head in Kingsbury Run again.